And welcome, everyone. This is the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and I'm joined by two great Canadians this week. We've got Sculpty Boy Spleenface. Spleen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. And we've also got the other Sculpty Boy and Pongo. Pongo, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Glad to be here as always.
Yeah, it's good to hear from you guys again. I know I was sick last week. I had strep throat last week, so I appreciate you guys, Pongo and Cobblepot and Charles, for running the episode last week for me. But I'm back, and we've got a great show lined up for you guys today. But before we get into that, I just want to take a moment and thank all of you for joining us this week. If you do like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you want access to our Discord server, as well as some extra content, make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors, or check out the link in the description. We've also got a TCG player affiliate link now. And so does that mean that all three of our separate channels have individual TCG player links now? Because I know Team Turn 3 has one. Does In the North have one? Yeah, so look at us. We're all professionals.
Exactly.
This means we're competitors, right? So
there you go.
Yep.
We're fighting to get those hard-earned TCG player affiliate dollars.
Yeah. But if you want to,
you get to frame this as a super ambitious crossover, right?
Unlikely allies. Yeah.
Wendy's and McDonald's, do something together. It's oh my god.
It's like when Wendy's and McDonald's both shit post on Burger King on Twitter.
Wendy's and McDonald's, if you're listening, please sponsor us.
Yeah,
or Card Kingdom or TCG player, whoever.
Sorry, Callahan, have I said Wendy's and McDonald's enough to we have a quota, right?
So anyway, if you want to help support the show, you can go down into our description, and we've got our TCG player affiliate link down there. Buying cards, you can use that. Greatly appreciate it. So today we wanted to, today we're recording this here on Thursday, and there's all these, today they just announced all the Strixhaven stuff, and I know a lot of people are going to expect our next episode or some of our upcoming episodes to be on talking about Strixhaven, but we're gonna talk instead about a card that's been here for, when was this printed?
November 2016, I believe.
2016. So it's been out for 5 years. Is our good friend King Thrasios, and whether or not in the current meta of competitive EDH, where it stands, is it still as good as it used to be? Is it still a juggernaut of the metagame? Is it still a juggernaut just in the format? And kind of where we land on that. So, a couple things just before we get too deep into our opinions on things. And I think it was, Pongo, we were talking about this beforehand when we were kind of getting everything ready, is, there was a period of time where people thought Thrasios was better than Tymna and all these things. And, really, why was it that people thought Thrasios was so good, and why was Thrasios so good for so long in competitive EDH?
Yeah, so just to be clear, even though I guess the verbiage that you were using sort of made it sound like we might have a conclusion already, I don't think we do, and I think we're going to have a spirited discussion about this card. But
in the past.
Yeah, certainly early on when Thrasios was spoiled, if we can compare him to some of the other partners that were spoiled, partners that we will surely be discussing today, he was sort of the one that immediately grabbed people's attention. And I think a big part of that is because, there's a multitude of reasons, but a big part of that was just the idea that as an infinite mana outlet, he could easily be compared to something that kind of already existed in the form of Tasigur. And so people were comparing him to Tasker at the time when they were saying, oh, well, Tasker's already a solid deck. We already know that this is a real deck. So, if you just add an
Throwback,
extra,
am I right?
yeah, if you just add an extra color,
if you're listening,
if we just add an extra color to this deck, then, it's going to be great. Right. So like, it was pretty obvious, I think, from the get-go that Thrasios was going to be very, very powerful. What's interesting is that probably people overlooked other commanders or other partners as a result.
Yeah, and I think that it was honestly kind of interesting to see. I think that that continued, like, I think the obvious, competitor for the best partner of, at least for the few years after they were printed, would have been Tymna. And I think that even reasonably late into the development, when people had to realize, like, okay, Tymna's incredibly strong, and like Thrasios and Tymna were pretty dominant, and were the go-to for not only the like Nas Scepter Consult archetype and Flash Hulk. I think that people still a lot of people viewed Thrasios as the stronger of the pair, and I think that's also in part because the effect he had, like, he was much more sort of feast or famine, where when a game was dominated by Thrasios, like, everyone knew, everyone saw, whereas Tymna's like a little bit more quiet, right, where you drew 2 extra cards a turn or 1 or 2 extra cards a turn for like 5 turns. You drew 8 extra cards over 5 turns. And like, that's insane. Like, saying that out loud, right? Like, 3 mana, draw 8 cards over 5 turns is absurdly strong, but it's not like you don't see it happening in the same way where, like, oh, they just activated Thrasios 3 times in the end step. Like, oh, they're untapping and doing it again, and oh, like.
Well, so yeah, 12 mana, draw 3 cards versus 3 mana, draw 3 cards immediately. And that was also is a pretty
exacerbated. That was also like exacerbated, right, in the days where Paradox Engine was legal, and you could do all sorts of shenanigans with it, where, I think we were talking about this earlier, you can manually storm and use the mana to draw a bunch of cards, and then I'm sure even after that, people have seen where you just have like Thrasios and like a Seedborn Muse, and you're just every end step, okay, I'm gonna activate Thrasios a bunch. And so, like, in to go to your point, Spleen, is where it's just like people saw that, right?
Yeah, I think it, like, Thrasios had a very, very visible effect on the games that he had a big effect on, and I think Tymna was a little bit less visible, for a few different reasons.
Right.
Yeah, I do think that a big part of that was just, people needed to play with Tymna a lot and kind of like come to this realization over time about how busted she was.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the opinion certainly shifted, like, over time it shifted towards, like, okay, Tymna's arguably the better of the two, but I think that it didn't shift, like, maybe quite as much as might have been expected.
Certainly, I think as much as people would probably feel now.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like for a really long time, and maybe this was, in my head, probably pre-Flash, and maybe even for a period of time afterwards, where they were, if you didn't think Tymna was better than Thrasios, you at least thought they were both about equal, right? Like, you at least saw them as about the same quality.
I don't think that's true either. I think there were a lot of people who believed, like, I certainly spoke with a lot of people who were pretty convinced that Thrasios was the stronger card by a comfortable margin.
Yeah, I mean,
obviously
we can trace out
particularly hard data on that, but
we can trace out some of the evolution of like those early Thrasios decks. And certainly like Thrasios Vial was actually like one of the earlier builds utilizing Thrasios and like Scepter type strategies, and obviously Paradox Engine, which existed back then. And then that kind of like got ported into Thrasios Tymna afterward, right? Like, so that kind of like goes to show that people were still kind of like thinking from the mindset of like, you know, like the Jaleva type decks that existed back in the day, you know, like kind of like porting over that style of deck to some extent, right? Like with the wheel package and sort of, you know, that sort of orientation of sort of like storming. And then it was only sort of a bit of a later innovation when people started to say like, okay, well, let's take it in a more mid-rangey direction rather than kind of like a fast stormy direction. And we're going to keep Scepter and we're obviously going to still have a couple of wheels and some wheel synergies. And like, we're obviously still going to have Paradox Engine, but like, you know, we're going to have Tymna here and maybe play a couple of mana dorks, and like get a little bit of value from there. And then like even another step after that was like the people who started jamming even more mana dorks in their Thrasios Tymna decks to try to leverage even more Tymna value. So, you know, there was sort of a progression there that was kind of like sort of optimization towards maximizing Tymna value and not necessarily people prioritizing her right out of the gate, you know, in favor of Thrasios.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think another thing that really illustrates how it took a little while for people to get out of the thinking of basing their 4-color decks on the 3-color decks that they had played before Partners was printed was like one of the most popular builds of Thrasios and Tymna for a decently long time was Doomtide Thrasios. And like, we can argue the merits of Doomsday, but I think it's like much harder to argue for the merits of High Tide in a 4-color list.
Right.
But it was like, I mean, it's a lot easier if you're in Zur or Jaleva, like white or red are a very minor part of your list. So you're kind of down to 2 colors. And then supporting High Tide is actually like pretty easy. But then, you know, once you get into 3 colors, and like green tends to be a pretty heavy part of that because you just have like a bunch of, you know, like the dorks, while they're not like hugely instrumental to your game plan, there's just kind of a lot of them, so it winds up inflating the green pip count of your deck, and therefore the green land count you need to support them. So, like, it's interesting to see how long people stuck with things like that without, you know, with porting a 3-color deck into 4 colors and just like adding some extra toys, as opposed to, I think, more designing from the ground up for 4 colors.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, to some extent, that's inevitable. I think that we have a tendency to evaluate cards based on our sort of existing heuristics and existing decks and like how cards slot into existing decks before people start to think about like the new novel ideas and the novel applications of cards. So I think that's just essentially like something of an inevitability to some extent. And it's sort of like a historical factor that we all have to contend with.
And so, you know, when we're talking about the quality then of Thrasios, and, you know, in these metas where, you know, you were playing all, because the big thing that I remember with Thrasios and Tymna, and there was a very long time where I know, at least from somebody, so for context, I'm significantly newer to cEDH than you guys are. Really fully diving in to completely cEDH like maybe 3.5 years ago.
I don't think that makes you much newer than I am.
Well, I am significantly like less well versed, and I feel much newer to the community, and much more like unaware of things before and like when I started getting in. Because like when I started getting in, I was like watching Labman videos, and that was it.
Right.
And so it's like if Cobble or Dan or Siggy and I guess Shaper weren't doing something on it, then I was probably not very aware of it. But I remember for a long time with Thrasios and Tymna that it was synonymous in my playgroup and to me with like Flash Hulk. And and to some extent, how accurate was that for like the rest of the cEDH world?
They were typically referred to as like Red Hulk builds, and then like there's the thing is there was never like a super great pile, unfortunately, in those colors. And like every once in a while there'd be like a new piece printed that would make people think like Torch Courier. People were like, okay, well now I can get Torch Courier Hermit Druid and like 3 CMC worth of whatever else I want. Like that was a thing. I think
Wild Canter I think was in that, right? Because then you could use
that was
to
like
activate
one of the things people did. I think Pathragas was big on he had some sort of Thrasios vial. It was like Hulk and Scepter and Nas deck for a very long time, but this was a while.
Yeah, so and eventually he moved on to Kenrith piles as well, in a similar vein to that.
Yeah. But yes, the first Hulk deck that got like a big acceptance, because Protean Hulk was unbanned after the partners were printed. Not a lot after, just a few months, but was Siggy's Breakfast Hulk list, which was the pile with Cephalid Illusionist and Nomad Zenkor, the Cephalid Breakfast combo, and then you fit Grand Abolisher, and then you just Dread returned Angel of Glory's Rise for Labman and Hapless Researcher. And obviously that deck still saw play right up until you could even argue that of all the Hulk decks that existed before it, Oracle Hulk or like Sushi Hulk was kind of an extension of that.
Right.
So, but it saw play right up until the printing of Oracle, because fitting Grand Abolisher into your Hulk pile was very, very hard to beat. Then there was a few years later, there was the definitely not Virals type lists that focused on having the sack outlets, and then that let you do Rector, Pattern, Natural Order type things, and then just go into some like persist combo pile, and then lastly, but initially that had to multi-Hulk until the printing of Lesser Masticore in Modern Horizons. And then lastly, partway through 2018, someone looked at cards and went, hang on a minute, Shuffle Hulk is a deck, huh? And I think that became the most dominant archetype. And I guess before Pongo gets insulted, also towards the end, I think largely after the printing of Jace, Wielder of Mysteries.
It was before. Jace eventually got slotted into this deck, so this was definitely not something that was spurred on by the printing of Jace.
Oh, really?
Yep.
I guess was Sacred Hulk, which issued playing white cards.
Wait, was that your deck, Pongo?
Yep.
I didn't know that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, which didn't play white cards other than Sacred Guide, and then your Hulk pile was just like Labman, Sacred Guide, Hapless Researcher, and something, usually Sylvan Safekeeper or Blood Pet.
Correct.
And then obviously that layered nicely with Consult, and you just had a much smaller, tighter Hulk pile, because you didn't have to play either like just a bunch of pieces like something like definitely not Virals or Sacrifice Hulk, Persist Hulk.
Right.
Yeah, in many ways, this was like the precursor to, what comes next, as I'm sure you're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then obviously Thassa's Oracle was printed, and then all that thought and discussion and comparison that people had put into Hulk piles kind of went out the window, because Oracle was like Oracle was hard enough to disrupt that you really, really didn't need Grand Abolisher. Like, it wins the game with a triggered ability, which meant if the Hulk trigger resolved, you were playing around like Angel's Grace and Stifle. That was it.
Right.
And so trying to get Grand Abolisher into play wasn't worth the like whole bunch of extra cards that Breakfast Hulk had to play. You needed your like, you know, your Dread Return, and then you had like all the like weird Dread Return combo pieces to get stuff out of your hand, and like the Narcomoeba,
Phantasmagorian for a while. Don't remind me, the dark days,
Cabal therapy, like all of this stuff.
We played some weird cards.
Like, yeah, you could just like get rid of all of that. You could like drawing your Hulk pieces was like super not a big deal because the deck just pivoted to consult like basically effortlessly. You had your backup line was Spellseeker for consult, and so it was like it basically took all the card quality of existing consult lists and combined them with the ease of winning of Flash Hulk lists, and was ridiculous and super unfun, and
was banned like a month or two later.
Fine,
a month or two,
3 months.
Yeah.
Was
it 3 later?
3 months. It felt like a month or two because no one played cEDH for a little bit, so it's like
it took exactly, like definitely more than a month or two, because I jammed quite a bit of that deck.
I played during that time. I played the like Kenrith Hermit Druid deck that also ran that, but I also did like Underworld Breach lines with it, so that you could like have a backup if you're Druid, or
have a backup for your backup in case you're.
You basically just had like three different ways of getting there effectively, and I went to a SCG like qualifier event, and I was playing like I think I was playing like Jund mid range or something in the event, and like made it like 3 rounds, lost all 3, and was like, all right, well, I'm done. And then went over to their commander stuff, and they were like, we're doing competitive commander, and I was like, all right. So I signed up, and I took that deck, and I ended up winning a box of Modern Horizons, which was their like grand prize, because I did not lose a single match, because I was either winning off of like a turn 1 or 2 Hermit Druid, or I was winning off of a Flash Hulk, or some odd combination of that. It was absolutely ridiculous.
This is like hard for me to believe, actually, knowing you now, that you ever played this deck. Like
I've played it on our channel.
You're describing Bizarro World Callahan to me.
That I played that. That was like the second gameplay episode that we did. I was playing the Druid Breach list, and that was the same deck that I played before. That had like I had to like make cuts for Flash Hulk, or add pieces, because when Flash got banned, and I eventually just moved off of Hulk because there's no reason to be on it.
Don't let Sick hear you say that.
I used to be like really into like just Storm, and it's really funny because like when the meta was like all mid-range sandbaggy, I was like wanting to go fast. And now that the meta wants to go super fast, I'm like, hey, let's slow down, everybody.
So basically, you're just a contrarian.
Clearly.
Or a hipster, one of the two, you know.
Yeah,
I guess they're not mutually exclusive.
So we just need to get people playing more Lavinia, and then Callahan just gives up. He just says, you know what, I can't play this deck anymore.
No, if you want me to stop playing Lavinia, just everybody play Najeela. That's the only deck that anybody ever plays. And if that's all you do, I'll eventually just be like, all right. I'm done.
This is like a win-win for me. I mean.
But anyway, we kind of Wow.
We have digressed a little bit.
A little bit. But anyway, so like Thrasios and Tymna was kind of synonymous with Flash Hulk for a while because why was it like the best shell for it?
I think when you said Flash Hulk, people thought of Thrasios and Tymna. When you said Thrasios and Tymna, I don't know that it was necessarily like everyone went, oh, Flash Hulk. Like obviously that was a big part of it, but like Razakats was a reasonably popular deck for a while.
A little bit later,
There was just like CST, or I guess at the time it was PST, right?
Yep.
Paradox Scepter Thrasios, which was a decent portion of the community thought that was actually the best deck for a while. I think that it slowly shifted towards more and more people thinking some variety of Flash Hulk was the best. But so I mean, Thrasios, obviously, we talked to, now I've said Paradox Engine, and I think Pongo touched on it earlier, but it very easily went infinite with Paradox Engine, much more easily than anything else. Like, even Tasigur at the time, which was like the other sort of infinite mana, put cards in your hand commander, people just started giving you counter spells.
Right.
And then, like, you could kind of try and, like, cast counter spells and then counter your counter spells and then counter those counter spells and then like activate Tasigur with like all your counter spells still on the stack targeting each other and like hope that you could mill into enough stuff that wasn't counter spells to like force your opponents to actually give you something
and then they just give you back a dark ritual and you're sad.
Yeah, it's like okay, well I guess we could they give you back like the mana rocks and you're like, okay, but if I want to play these mana rocks to get more mana, then I have to let all the counter spells that are on the stack resolve.
Yeah.
Disaster. And then like, yeah, so you could usually just like chain spells. And then if you found a way to hit Sensei's Divining Top, you actually just went infinite.
Oh yeah.
Because you could just put the top back up on top, flip into it, and then like you were guaranteed hitting a spell that you could cast every time. And obviously, Scepter, it's still a part of the meta. It's still like a decently solid combo. And then people did things like the Bomberman combo with Oryx Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond. So it was an infinite mana outlet, which gave you a nice backup no matter what your deck's primary plan was, or sometimes infinite mana and Thrasios was the primary plan. But then also in the Flash Hulk age, holding interaction was like a hugely important thing, and a lot of games came down to like people just passing like whoever blinks first sort of loses, and then having a commander that you can just like activate the end step before your turn to get card advantage could certainly like determine games, right? Because if everyone's drawing one card a turn and you're essentially trying to get to the point where you have enough interaction that you can force through like everyone else at a table, if you start activating Thrasios, like you're drawing, one extra card a turn that's like better than average because you get a scry, and it can also just flip you into like more dorks and like more mana, either lands or dorks or rocks, and then you start activating Thrasios twice a turn, and then 3 times a turn, and like it very quickly sort of snowballs and runs away with the game, and you can sculpt like. You sculpt the hand of 7 that's literally, it's like Flash, Hulk, 7 counter spells. It's like we've got Pact, Dispel, Silence, like Flusterstorm. And so like it played very nicely into a meta where tapping out was often very risky and like difficult to commit to.
And so like when we look at that then, and we compare it to now, right? Because now often the comparison is like, all right, well, who's the better Tymna partner? Is it Thrasios or is it Krom? And so when you look at those two next to each other, why is it that there's like some people look at Krom and go, this is better?
Yeah, I think a big part of this has to do with just like deck building ideas being a little bit different these days. So where like a lot of decks in the past were sort of, especially let's say like Thrasios style decks, were in some sense like, especially for Scepter, kind of top down, where it was like, okay, what am I doing to sort of like break Thrasios? I'm going to pursue like these infinite mana combos. I'm going to, you know, when it was legal, I'm going to play Paradox Engine. And sure, you know, when that got banned, you know, everyone kind of jumped ship and was like starting to play more like consult type strategies. You know, at the end of the day, it was still kind of this idea of having like a very, very slim win condition package and then just playing like kind of like a bunch of generically good interactive cards and value cards and stuff like that. Nowadays, people are building their decks a little bit differently. There's sort of more of a like synergy based approach within the deck itself, very much more like bottom up oriented in the sense that people are kind of like, you know, jamming a bunch of cards, jamming a win condition, notably Ad Nauseam, notably Peer into the Abyss, that's meant to kind of synergize with the rest of the cards in the deck. You know, ultimately, this is pushing people to play a ton of fast mana, ton of mana rocks, stuff like that. And, you know, in order to really leverage the sort of expensive but like one card win conditions that these represent, what they're doing is, you know, people were mulliganing a lot more. This is sort of, I would say, supported by the London Mulligan, which makes it, you know, a lot more profitable to do so. So I think that's another major thing that changed in the format that kind of, I would say, strengthened this type of strategy. And so if you're jamming your deck full of like synergy, rituals and stuff like that, you know, you don't necessarily always have a payoff that you will have in your opening hand or draw into in the early turns. So you're sort of really benefited by having kind of a mana sink in the command zone. You know, you could be running Thrasios, right, to do that. And some people have been exploring that. But alternatively, what you could be doing is playing something like Krom, which, you know, you're kind of paying 5 mana into one time, and then you're kind of just getting sort of passive value off of it. You know, I don't think it's necessarily too controversial to say that, you know, pound for pound, Krom is sort of like a more powerful card than Thrasios, where Thrasios is sort of potentially better is in sort of more specific circumstances. But like, you know, Krom is a 5 mana card, and 5 mana cards tend to be better than 2 mana cards.
You would think so, but given the history of design,
yeah, I mean, so we expect less from our 2 mana cards than we do from our 5 mana cards.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certain.
Yeah. So people are playing that, jamming it with Tymna, and it just so happens that having, you know, like a hasty flying attacker with Tymna is pretty strong to actually leverage Tymna. People are playing it alongside things now like other partners like Tevesh Sot and stuff like that. Sort of like another big 5 mana card that you can kind of just dump all of your fast mana into to get into play and then start generating a ton of value. So really, you know, I think what we're seeing is that sort of push towards decks that are, again, very synergy based, very bottom up, you know, oriented around Adnals and Breach and stuff like that. And so there's been like multiple things that have happened. I guess like red cards have been printed that have kind of further solidified that strategy as being particularly attractive. And, you know, just additionally, I think like losing Flash Hulk, losing Paradox Engine kind of chipped away at Thrasios's identity to some extent. That's not to say that they're not still Thrasios decks, but like he's lost market share. Let's just put it that way.
Right.
I think one of the other big things is that while people building decks trying to get to like an Ad Nauseam or even, you know, getting even farther all the way to a Peer as fast as possible means that they've started pulling out sources of mana that aren't recurrent. And like if you tap your mana vault and cast your Krom, you know, that's often like not ideal, but it's certainly a lot better than tapping your mana vault to activate Thrasios.
Right.
where if you can play like a Dark Ritual or a Mana Vault, or I mean obviously Jeweled Lotus, but that's like, I think this trend existed before the printing of Jeweled Lotus. Just using like rituals or temporary mana, landing Krom, and then having it draw you cards without having to put anything more into it, that synergizes in those decks that are playing those kinds of cards.
Right.
Whereas like Thrasios decks tend to be playing, like, you want your mana sources to untap so you can do it all again next turn. So you play dorks, but you also play like, usually you play like big dorks, right? You play
Bloom Tender.
instead of Grim Monolith, you play Bloom Tender or Priest of
Tap,
Titan,
draw card.
Faber or Elder.
pretty decent.
Yeah, so like it's a little bit slower. I think another thing that gets somewhat overlooked is the amount of free interaction that has become available. Has meant that like tapping out, first of all, is like, it's less bad, because, like, there was Force of Will and then there was Pact of Negation, but Pact of Negation isn't really a free interaction spell, especially in the early game, right? Like if it's like turn 2 and you're like, okay, I played Mana Vault on turn 1, I could just like slam Krom here, like tap the Mana Vault, slam Krom, like Pact of Negation, and I see you do that. I don't go like, well, I can't try and go off here because what if he has Pact of Negation? Because you can't pay for it. And like, even if you can pay for it, it's often like time walking yourself. So it was basically Force of Will for free interaction. But now we have Force of Will, Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, and Deflecting Swat. Plus some of the 1 mana interaction has been rounded out with things like Veil of Summer, Miscast. So like tapping out or tapping down, I think, has become a lot easier, and it now doesn't send nearly as strong a signal as it used to, because I think if someone tapped out on turn 2 before, I think Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swat are like the biggest contributors to this, but Force of Negation helped. In 2018, if someone tapped out on turn 2, I just assumed they didn't have anything. It's like, okay, maybe they have Force of Will. Every once in a while, I run into the Force of Will. But now it's like, people tap out, and it's like, oh, well, they must just have Fierce Guardianship, because otherwise, like, why would they tap out here if they, didn't have it? Or it's like, oh, that makes sense, right? Rather than hold 2-minute interaction, I've seen people like play Vile Smash. If someone like plays Vile Smasher, taps out to play Vile Smasher, I'm like, okay, they have Fierce Guardianship, obviously, because otherwise, why would you do that? So it's like tapping out has become a lot easier to do for a few different reasons, which means that the strength of Thrasios, which is that like you can activate it at instant speed, has become much less valuable over time as well. And obviously also not being able to represent Flash loses some value for Thrasios.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of respects, that was sort of like Thrasios' identity, and in some sense that was like Green Dex's identity for some, year or so, maybe a little bit longer, leading up until the Flash ban. And so, with that being gone, some of these decks have sort of lost a little bit of, what they were about, kind of like the best thing to be doing in those colors. And so like, it's been, compounding that even more is the fact that like last year, Green didn't really get any new cards to speak of.
And all the good cards felt like they came out in red.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So like, it's not like we necessarily got like new big draws to playing Green either.
Yeah, I was like, surely there must have been something, and I'm like, actually, just nope, there really wasn't. I was like, oh, what about? No, that was 2019. Oh, what? No, that was also 2019.
Right. Allosaurus Shepherd is.
Allosaurus
Shepherd? I mean, that's a hell of a card, but the problem is that it's a hell of a card.
Definitely like narrow.
Yeah, it's a hell of a card for lower color decks than like the 4-color piles that are trying to win with like a blue and a black spell.
Yeah.
Right.
That doesn't do much for Oracle Consult wins.
Right.
So I'll posit this question to both of you. In 2021, what is your opinion? Is Thrasios still good? And where do you evaluate it relative? Do you evaluate it above or under Krom, as far as being the best Tymna partner, which is kind of how you evaluate these like top end.
Are we sorry?
decks.
So we're talking specifically in the context of being a Tymna partner.
I think there was two questions there.
Just
Yeah, that because that might change my answer.
fair enough. So in 2019, then, and we're looking at this because I feel like now we're kind of looking at this as it is a Tymna partner, because like I guess Thrasios Krom does exist.
Thrasios Vial does exist. I mean,
The Thrasios Vial too. So okay, I'll just put it to you this way.
Yeah,
Which one do you think is better?
Thrasios Vial?
who would even consider
Which one
playing
do
that?
you think is better then in 2021? And I'll start with Spleenface.
I think it's still Thrasios.
Thrasios
I think,
Tymna?
I think that
No, just do you think
Is a
Thrasios
better partner for
is
Tymna.
better than
Gotcha.
Krom or vice versa?
yeah, I think Thrasios is better than Krom. We've seen a few different like versions of Thrasios decks. There's like the Thrasios Rograk deck. There's Thrasios Tavesh. It's like in very specific metas, Thrasios is not good. Like a fast in a fast enough pod, it's not good. But conversely, I've also seen like very early Kroms, not draw cards. And I think that assuming like a reasonable spread across those games, the hands where Krom is really good, I think are like generic. They're like kind of worse hands. They're hands where you're like spending a lot of your gas to land the Krom. And that's like a nice backup plan in the decks where like you want to have the gas to play spells that are typically better than Krom. But sort of Thrasios is still reasonably viable as like a primary plan in a way that Krom just isn't.
Right.
And I guess now the question gets thrown to me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take the very contrary position here, and I'm going to go...
Spleen's an idiot. No one should listen to him.
I'm going to go out and say that I have not been excited to play Thrasios with Tymna in particular in any shell other than Razaketh Reanimator recently. I have been substantially more interested in partnering Thrasios with red partners. In particular, I kind of like the Thrasios Ikiri, Thrasios Bruce decks, because I feel like even if you are missing out on black, like the Emil Dockside combos are really powerful and quite accessible thanks to green. I feel like Vial Smasher and Thrasios is just so much stronger these days, by virtue of, again, Dockside Extortionist, by virtue of Underworld Breach. Just having a better ad nauseum, like having kind of like access to one card win conditions there is like super powerful.
Right.
So, I feel like Thrasios Tymna, like the kind of more like mid-rangey piles, if I was going to build something like that, like a Thrasios Tymna like consultation deck, I would almost feel like I have to be playing like Collector Oof for it to be something that I'm interested in doing. Otherwise, I feel like I'm doing a worse version of a different type of deck. And personally, I don't like doing that. Some people like to sort of build what they think is like the best version of a given commander, and they're okay with playing that even if it's sort of just a worse version of another commander. I would personally prefer to play like what I think is the best thing that's unique that deck can be doing. So you're saying you'd rather
play Kenrith for like those kind of mid-range collector.
Yeah, I mean,
consult decks.
probably I'm not going to play Collector Roof in my Kenrith decks because I also want to be playing like Dockside type combos in that deck too, which is an interesting tension. And I wouldn't fault someone for like trying it. I've seen it and I've seen it work, but I think it's a tension that I'm like not necessarily convinced the deck needs to have. But that's just my opinion on the matter. It's neither here nor there. I think that I prefer Tymna Krom again because there is so much strength in having one card win conditions and building around your one card win conditions. If playing Najeela has taught me anything, it's just like having clean lines to threaten a victory that are like very easily accessible is such a powerful thing to be doing. To be able to like pivot off of somebody's misstep and be able to win kind of on a dime is extremely powerful. And I think that Thrasios Tymna, by virtue of typically needing to play mostly like 2-card combos and not necessarily being able to be built to like leverage 1-card combos very, very well, in my mind kind of pigeonholes it to a certain extent to be playing more of like that kind of like grindier style of deck where you might be playing like Collector Roof to attack the meta. You might be playing like Deafening Silence, something like that. And then if I wanted to be playing Thrasios, I'm much more interested in doing Razaketh Reanimator because I think that Thrasios actually contributes significantly to that strategy, or like a Thrasios Bruce deck because I think that Dockside Extortionist is insane. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm certainly much more convinced. Like if we say specifically in the context of a Tymna partner, I think it's like a lot easier to argue for Krom because then we're not just talking about like sort of what the cards do themselves, but more like what like the fact that you get like Dockside and Breach, for example, is like is huge. I guess like if you wanted to compare them like more directly, I guess I'm curious where you stand on Thrasios Vial versus like Krom, one of the Go.
Sure, like Krom Ikra or Krom.
Krom Ikra.
Yeah, Krom Rayhan. So that's a good question, I think. And that's where I think I'm not necessarily sold one way or the other 100%. I think that like there's distinct advantages to playing Thrasios in that type of shell. I think like Neoform into Hull Breacher or like Eldritch Evolution, if you're playing that for some reason, into Notion Thief is like a really, really powerful line. I think probably we shouldn't be talking about the Eldritch Evolution line so much as the Neoform one. I think that like having like all of those rocks that, you can use to theoretically like turn into, pump into Thrasios is okay. It's not fantastic. I think that's less good than Krom. Overall, I think those two decks want to be built a little bit differently. I think that like the Krom Ikra version wants to be built a little lower to the ground, focused more on like sort of immediate mana and rituals. And then like the Thrasios Vial version wants to be built a little bit more resiliently. So they're kind of like two different flavors in a sense of that type of strategy. To some extent, it's going to boil down to your meta and your preferred play style, as to which one is strictly better. I know that's a bit of a cop-out of an answer. For my own play style, it's sort of shifted towards preferring to play the Krom type game rather than the Thrasios game, if that's, the concrete answer you need.
Which is interesting because like I feel like Team Turn 3 is not necessarily the healthiest environment
sure.
for Krom.
Although I do want to point out that I think every time you bust out that deck, you tend to do very well.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a 4-color ad nauseum pilot. It's a good deck. I just mean like I've some people in various discussions I've had have sort of essentially claimed that like if you play a Krom on like turn 1 or turn 2, it's going to draw you like usually it's like at least 4 cards in the next 2 turn cycles, and like I don't know that that's like as reliable.
No, that's less true for when we're playing on other places. 3, for sure.
we tend to be a little disciplined.
Yeah, I mean, I've Lord knows I've played Heuristic Study and somehow not drawn any cards off of it after like 3 turns.
I actually don't know.
And then you added me to the group, and
all bets were off. Yeah.
Since I've had Tymna Krom together for NSL, I actually don't know that I've ever wound up casting Krom. Like, maybe I did once.
You definitely did on stream. I can say that much, but maybe not in the NSL.
No, I meant on stream. Like, I put the deck I had the deck together in the summer for NSL, but then I had it together for like the last month or so.
I can say for sure that you've done it on stream though. I'm very confident about that.
That sounds right.
That, with Tymna, and then, you started essentially gushing about how good Tymna is, which you weren't wrong.
I mean, Tymna's a pretty good card. Yeah, hot takes.
Well, you guys,
can we get this labeled as a hot takes episode? Tymna is good.
You guys should be getting your TMS Thrasios and Tymna.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Soon too.
That's adorably optimistic. Clearly, you know nothing about the Canadian postal system.
Yeah, it's going to take a month, but that's okay.
I mailed Nathan he bought a card off of me not too long ago, and I sent it to him. It took him like 10 days. So I don't know.
Well, maybe we'll get lucky.
But anyhow,
I mean, I'm joking a little bit, but
yeah. So. It's very interesting to hear all these opinions. I am still the opinion that Thrasios is still better. But I also tend to play grindy types of decks generally that like to be able to hold up mana, sandbag, sit on interaction, and then, having an outlet that you can dump your mana into is like ideal for me.
Right. You prefer to play a game where everyone else has failed to win, and then you can kind of just like coast through the goals, like the goalposts,
Right. Yeah. Like I just and maybe that's just a play style thing for me, right? Where it's just like I have played a handful of games with Tymna Krom, and like it's just. There's something about the way that it plays where I just feel like I can't sandbag and sit on interact. Like I always feel like I'm playing a combo deck, and I'm not playing a mid-range deck when I'm playing that. And maybe that's just a me thing, but I feel like distinctly the lack of green, and it's like.
There's definitely an element. There's definitely an element of that green gives decks. Staying power, just like
right
in that you can get a little bit higher on the amount of mana you have that untaps every turn, right. And then you get you get your Sylvan Library and Carpet of Flowers. You get the creature tutors also enable some amount of hate bears isn't exactly the right word, but access to like at least somewhat disruptive elements in a way that. There's the access to creatures is so good that you frequently use creature tutors to find disruptive elements as opposed to like win cons, which is not really something you see with any other card type or any other color. Like dedicated stacks decks sometimes, Enlightened Tutor for like a stacks piece, but a non-dedicated deck like Razakats, sometimes I'm like, I have this tutor, like I'm just, I have this Neoform. I'm not going to find Consult. I'm just going to find, Drannith Magistrate or Collector Roof or Hull Breach or Opposition Agent, whatever it is. And that, gives you a lot of tools to extend a game. And then actually put the advantage that your mid-range pieces give you in a longer game into effect.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I don't know. I also think the other thing that Thrasios gives, and I don't think this is talked about enough, is the amount of opening hands that you can just like, I'll shuffle, look at a 7 and go, yep, that's good enough. And it's just like, when I'm on the, and I think it's really more of a green thing, right? But it's like when I'm on these sans green strategies, my mulligans feel worse every time than when I'm playing like a Thrasios deck, where I'm just like, okay, so there's a dork and 2 lands and like some amount of interaction and maybe another like mana rock or something. Like, I just feel like the hands that are keepable are so much better.
Well, have you played much with any Thrasios decks that aren't Tymna decks as well? Just out of curiosity, I know you have some sort of brew, like you've played a Thrasios Tymna deck, if I remember correctly, but
I played a lot of Thrasios Vial Smasher for a really long time. That was like my main deck was Paradox Storm.
But like since the Flash ban or since the Pension ban at least.
What was it? I played some Evolution.
Okay. Because like I think like one of the things that was sort of quietly overlooked, or sometimes quietly overlooked, even during Flash Hulk, and I think it's like less true now than it was, but it's still somewhat true, is the strength of the Landork Land Tymna opener.
Right.
It's just like, I feel like that's like a standard like chess book opening, you know? It's like, this is like, so it doesn't give you like a massive advantage or like some,
it's a setup play.
Nothing crazy's happening, but it's like, it's solid, you know, like there's a lot of different directions you can take it. Like, it's just like, you know, like your Rui Lopez or whatever.
Sure.
Or like an Italian gamer. And like you play that and then it fits very nicely, assuming you untap turn 3, which is sometimes a questionable assumption, but you can sort of gauge that a little bit. If you go like Landork, Land Thrasios, then Landork, Land Tymna, then sticking the Thrasios, drawing a card, and having 2 mana on turn 3 is like a decently solid position. It's not like insane. It's not, you know, like anything to write home about, but it's a playable position in most games, and it's incredibly consistent because you can run 6 or 7, like Thrasios Tymna, you can run, is it 7, 8 mana dorks? That like 1 mana dorks,
right?
3 green ones: Birds, Noble, Deathrite, Deep Shadow, Pilgrim. I guess Boreal Druid, but we'll ignore Boreal Druid because it's bad. Like, like, you know, you can run certainly at least 7, 8 if you're willing to play Pilgrim, which a lot of decks aren't, but whatever. And that means that like such a high percentage of your openers will essentially have the floor of Landork, Land Tymna, Land Thrasios, play the game.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those openings don't excite me like nearly as much as they used to. I just feel like some of the tools that you know, in particular red decks have gotten recently, the way people have started building their decks towards, you know, more proactive game plans as opposed to, you know, setting up value engines to kind of like grind with the Hulk decks, has sort of like made it so that I don't necessarily want to be keeping like that super dirtly type hand. So like it's interesting that you brought that up, and Callahan, I think that it's especially interesting that you brought up, you know, sort of like some of those hands that you really, really feel like you like to keep with Thrasios Tymna. It kind of reminds me of a video that Braden from the cEDH cast put out. And I'm not trying to call anybody out here or anything like that, but he was doing like a Grady Keeps, I think, with medium green. And some of those hands he was evaluating, they were like literally like, you know, Mana Dork, Mox Diamond, Mana Dork, you know, like kind of like dump your hand, have 4 mana, like cast Thrasios turn 2, and then like have like 4 mana on turn 3, but like no interaction in hand, no tutor, just like a bunch of mana. And he was like, "Oh, this is fantastic. This is great." And I'm like, you know, to me, I don't play that deck, so maybe if you're playing that type of deck, you have to anticipate that like you're going to be playing against a lot of other kind of grindy mid-rangey decks, and in that situation, that's a hand that you do keep. And so if you're evaluating that hand from that lens, then sure, perhaps that's a great keep. And, you know, I'm sure Braden had his reasons for evaluating that hand that way. But when I look at that hand, I'm like, man, this hand does nothing. Like, I'm going to spend 4 mana to activate Thrasios, and that's like what I'm getting excited about as a hand. Like, no tutor, no literally like no counter spells to defend myself from people's win attempts, like in those early turns. You know, it's just like all engine. And, you know, I've kind of like,
all engine, no.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I've kind of felt like, you know, you can't really keep hands like that these days anymore. You like, your hand needs to really have like a plan to actually close out the game. And that's something that I do see. And I wasn't trying to single anyone out in particular. I just found that, you know, that one sticks in my mind. But I've played games against people where I've like found out later that they kept like, you know, like land dork, you know, like some other kind of disruptive piece and like a Flusterstorm or something. And like the hand's plan is like literally just like draw into the thing. like I kind of have to draw into it. And I think that can be a fine plan if you've got 1 card win conditions. I think it becomes a much more questionable plan when you're relying on 2 card win conditions. And
I think
yeah. No, I was just going to finish by saying that, like, you know, that's sort of like where I'm coming from in particular with Thrasios and Tymna, you know, how they tend to be playing more A plus B combos.
I think it's also like it matters a lot, not just like what decks you're playing against, but what people you're playing against and their tendency to like jam or check or call bluffs or whatever. Because like, personally, if I saw someone, you know, they open like, let's say they go like land, Mox, Dork, and then they're playing like Tymna and Thrasios. They have like still, you know, 4 or 5 cards in hand, and then they pass with a bunch of mana open. Like, I'm immediately very nervous about trying to do anything into that, right? It's like they could, you know, there's almost certainly at least 1 piece of interaction, possibly more. But like some people, they just like take the risk and sort of check, right? And so like if you play against people who have a tendency to check, then 1 piece of interaction is not like enough, right? Someone tries to go off, you know, they pull your Flusterstorm, and then the next person tries to go
right.
off, and you're like, well, I guess we die. But like if you play against people who sort of respect that a little bit more, like sometimes 1 piece of interaction, you know, can stop 3 people from going off for a turn cycle. And it very much depends on like who those people are and how they tend to play, whether or not that's true.
Yeah, I mean, there's also just the idea that like 4 mana, draw 1 card is not necessarily spectacular value either. Like, it's okay when you know that the game is going to go on for multiple turns, or, you know, you have the ability to play like a mana dork, like a Bloom Tender or something that's going to like let you amp that up to potentially drawing like 2 additional cards a turn. And, you know, you start to like subsequently like develop your mana more and like make that engine really, really powerful. But like when your turn 3 is like, I'm going to draw a card.
Well, yeah, which is why I tend to, you know, try and develop Tymna first, usually when I'm playing, like, obviously not when I'm playing Thrasios File Smasher.
Right.
Develop File Smasher first, but, like, I think that those kinds of hands, and I evaluate those kinds of hands a lot differently outside of the contexts of having Tymna as well as Thrasios,
sure.
Right? Like, when you can play Tymna and draw a couple cards, like, if your first Thrasios activation is after you've already drawn 2 cards off your Tymna, then like it definitely feels a lot better to have kept a hand without sort of a clear path to victory initially. But obviously when you just have Thrasios, and so your first Thrasios activation is like the first time you've drawn extra cards, yeah, that's definitely a little bit more dicey.
Yeah, and I mean, we're still talking about hands where like you're potentially, tapping out or tapping low both turns 2 and turn 3, right? Like, and to me, that's not necessarily spectacular either, considering like what decks can do these days on turn 2 and 3.
I mean, I wouldn't consider casting Thrasios off a dork on turn 3, like after Tymna on turn 2, to be tapping low. Like that lets you pass with 2 mana open, which is certainly enough to represent like a lot of different pieces of interaction and possibly multiple pieces of interaction.
Sure.
But yeah, obviously tapping out for Tymna on turn 2 is can be a little dicey, especially if like you saw somebody else just spaghetti out, like
right. And at that point,
or something like that,
you're theoretically like, it seems like you're only drawing 1 card off of your Tymna at that point, right? Like, so it's not like the case where you're drawing 2 cards off of your Tymna. Like,
yeah, you draw 1 card off the Tymna, and then it's like then on the turn 3, and then it's like the next turn you have both Thrasios and Tymna who can attack. Maybe you can draw 2 cards, even if you only draw 1. And then you can, if you play a land, you could play like a 1 mana spell, like another dork, or like a 2 mana rock that taps, and then still be holding up a Thrasios activation. And like that's when that deck, like that for me, that's when like I start feeling like quote unquote comfortable.
Yeah, and I mean I like that a lot more when
decks.
people are playing more interactive and Staxier types of decks, where
yeah, there's definitely pods where you're like, that's just not good enough, and so you're mulliganing a little bit more aggressively for some sort of fast mana, so you can try and, turn 1 Thrasios, turn 2 Tymna, or something like that.
Or like actually make a more proactive play.
Yeah, turn 1, Dork, turn 2, like Rhystic Study holding up a mana, or like turn 1 Dork and like Soul Ring or Crypt or Mox or whatever, and then turn 2 Rhystic Study holding up some amount of mana or something like that is more where you want to be. Or like obviously Hull Breacher.
Yeah, Hull Breacher into wheel being, something you'd prefer to be doing.
Or you mean like into somebody else's wheel.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a very interesting conversation, to say the least. Hearing all the different opinions from you guys about it, and also some of the history behind it and kind of where it was. Because especially from somebody like me, where, in 2016 when that came out, I was still playing my Grim zombie tribal deck. So it's interesting to hear from people who have kind of been in the format a little bit longer.
Okay, wait, Callahan, I have to ask, what do you think my first cEDH deck was?
Your first one?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. When did you start playing?
Start playing Magic or start playing...
like cEDH?
Well, this is kind of why I'm asking that
question. Oh, okay. Oh, fuck. I don't know. Like Zur or something. I don't know.
It was Kess.
Okay.
Which came out halfway through 2017. I feel like you're acting like
Spleenface is ancient.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's like...
I think I'm the only person here who played before Thrasios was released.
My point is that you guys, like Spleen, you certainly are more well-versed in those things than I am, I feel like, is what I'm saying. But at any rate, getting your opinions on those things, very interesting. And I don't know, I just still think Thrasios is really good. I'm a little biased, though,
Well, are we concluding that Thrasios is bad? Because I don't think that was my conclusion.
I don't think anyone said that.
No. My conclusion is I still think it's better than Krom, even as a Tymna partner, because I just like, and I've seen Tymna Krom like grind really far, but I think the colors give you more grind potential. It just I just think that for the type of game plan that you're going to want to be doing on like a Tymna strategy, Thrasios makes more sense than Krom does, even though your ability to your potential top end to draw like a bananas amount of cards in Tymna Krom is potentially higher, right? Because you can, okay, so we draw one from the Krom from somebody casting 2 cards. We're also swinging with Krom, and it has evasion with the Tymna out. And so I get all of that. I don't know. I just think that, in my opinion, I like Thrasios more.
I mean, that's fair. I think, if I could say anything, and if there's any message that I could sort of try to leave people off with, is that at the end of the day, as somebody who was here before Thrasios was printed playing this format, and, I guess I've been observing a large number of shifts in the format. What I can say is that we're talking about a swinging pendulum in a lot of respects. Back when I started, red was very much actually like still considered generally better than white. People gave a slight edge to Jaleva even over Zur. And those were sort of like the 2 decks to beat. And then Thrasios was released, and the pendulum swung very firmly into the green camp. This was predated to some extent by like Tazri, but I would say really got solidified with the release of Thrasios and Tymna. I think we're seeing the pendulum swinging back in the direction of red with, the insane red cards that we've gotten recently. And I think that probably in the future, we're going to see the pendulum swing again, with perhaps the printing of new powerful white cards that might, I know that's a meme, but like, things that might potentially attack some of like these really like Storm E or Storm adjacent type strategies. Or, just new green cards that might sort of reinvigorate interest in sort of these flagging archetypes. At the end of the day, there's not like a truth to the matter, right? There's just, because it's a moving target, new cards are being printed all the time. So we can't make any conclusion that will withstand the test of time.
No, we're right, and this will be right forever.
Right.
Wizards, print a white hate bear that says your opponents can't win the game, you cowards.
I mean, like, I feel like that's doable.
It's actually just like so fair.
Yeah, it's like pretty doable, I think. Like a 1/3. It just dies to all removal.
Or like a 2/1 with some like,
if you want to make it really squishy.
First strike or something.
Yeah, 2/1 like vigilance or something.
I don't know. It's interesting, and we're gonna have a Strixhaven set review coming up here in the next few weeks as Strixhaven spoilers start to really come out. I tell you what,
and as Oracle Consult is supplanted as the best combo in the format by Chain of Smog.
I think we're gonna have to have a Chain of Smog intervention episode.
I think that card is going to cause problems in other Eternal formats, potentially.
I think
just because of how many copies of these Magecraft cards you can cast.
Right. I think I would tend to think that that's way less spicy of a take, way less hot of a take than like this is a playable combo in cEDH.
Oh, I don't know. I think it's unplayable, particularly in like limited color environments, but it's certainly not Oracle Consult.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
The thing
I'm
is,
being a little harsh.
I shouldn't get into this because I have opinions. I think it's going to Chain of Smog is going to end up getting banned personally. I think that every casual player in the world is going to jump on a Chain of Smog and some Magecraft shenanigan. And it has, I see the writing on the wall of like Paradox Engine people getting annoyed with it the same way they got annoyed with Paradox Engine written all over.
Well, the thing is that like the problem with Paradox Engine wasn't that it won the game. The problem was that it didn't win the game.
Yep. Ding, ding, ding.
And like, I don't know, this to me just feels like another A+B, and like in many ways it's an A+B that's a lot worse than existing A+Bs.
Right.
So like, I don't see a world where you ban ban Chain of Smog and not like Tainted Pact or
that's what I was going to say.
Or just Thassa's Oracle.
I mean,
I don't
agree.
understand how you make that argument.
I would. This has nothing to do with our episode, and this is just a nice bonus clip for people. But like my argument to that is, I think that they like it. I think what will, if I have a prediction before we even see all the Magecraft cards, my prediction is that Chain of Smog is going to be like the gateway drug for people that's going to get them to see how busted, like really busted, Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact are. Because like people have it lower power like tables have this like understanding that it's good. But I don't think people are going to really understand it until they see something similar, want that banned, and then the RC is going to make a similar argument that you just made. And then people are going to be like, well, we should ban that too then. And then I guess
I just like, is it just could be because you think like Magecraft is a cool mechanic and it's like appealing that you think that people who weren't previously putting cheap A+Bs in their deck are going to put, I guess I could see the argument that it's like with Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, you kind of have to make the decision to run both. Whereas if you're like building a Spellslinger deck and you just throw in a bunch of the like Magecraft cards because like they synergize with what your deck's doing, then it's actually just like one card to. Well, yeah, and that's kind of my argument overall. Is it's not that it's just a one card like one A+B whatever, or that it's significantly. It's the fact that every Magecraft card it's gonna go off with, and I feel like enough casual people are going to see that, get real irritated by that, and push for a ban. Notably, it only goes off with Magecraft cards that kind of do something that wins the game, right? Like if it's something it only wins the game with it goes off with every single mage. It gets you a Magecraft trigger for every single mage. Yeah, you can get infinite Magecraft triggers, so like, but who cares if like you make your like 2/2 with no evasion, like, you know, a billion 2, and like it gets blocked. Yeah, or so like you know, of the Magecraft cards we've seen so far, it combos with 3, I think. Okay. 2. So it makes combos with a lot. Doesn't combo with the draw one. No. I mean, with extra hoops, right? Like if you squint hard enough. Hoops. No, it takes some hoops because you need, like, if your deck can win from, or like if you build your deck so that it can win from my deck in my graveyard, then it does. But obviously that requires other cards. Yeah. And I don't know that casual players will build that. It combos with the Planeswalker, combos with Bloom Apprentice. It combos with the one that makes treasures. Oh, true. Yep. Yeah. And then, but that doesn't necessarily win on the spot. That just makes infinite mana, and you have no cards in your hand. It makes infinite mana. Makes your Dragon's Guard elite, the green one. It makes it infinitely large. Sure, but it's a creature without haste or evasion. Right. Like that's definitely not like. I think that will, like, discard your hand, make an infinite. I actually, like, don't even know if that's particularly. But there's also a lot of people who will do, like, the Quandrix Apprentice one, where they're going to be like, all right, I'm going to get every land out of my deck and all those things. And it's just. Sure, but, like, they go to your hand, right? Like, it's. And then you discard them, right? And also you discard them. Yeah. Like, it's Chain of Smog, right? You do discard them. Right. So you put all the lands in your deck in your graveyard. Like, Mana Severance is already a card and no one plays it. Yeah, I think like no one playing casually is going to want to do something where you discard your hand entirely if it doesn't win the game. Right. I don't know. We'll also see what else comes out, but I have this sneaky feeling people are going to play it because Magecraft, it's flashy, it's cool, it's new. And like, it's not explicitly competitive, if that makes sense. And I just think enough people are going to look at that, play it, and there's going to be enough people that are going to get frustrated and mad by it that it will
at the very least have a conversation.
Well, you know what? I guess you're just more optimistic than me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward, like, well, I'm not looking forward. I, like, kind of hope that this happens, if only because, like, in a world where this happens...
wants to reevaluate Oracle Consult, I'm
exactly,
not upset
right?
by that.
Right. It kind of opens the door to, like, other 2-card combos potentially being reevaluated, and that would kind of be where I would be... not optimistic about this happening, but like I would welcome it happening to some extent.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm a very big proponent of like either banning Thor or banning Consult Pact. But you know, that's neither here nor there. And if this is the avenue to get there, then hell yeah, let's do it. In my opinion, but
yeah, but then we just play that's like other Underworld Breach combos, right?
Yeah, but there's more surface area to like interact with. Like the whole problem with Thor is the fact that it's a triggered ability. It's way harder to interact with than like Labman.
Sure.
But anyway, that's a different
a whole other episode.
This is already a different podcast, and now that's
true.
a different podcast.
This has been 3 podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.
3?
Yeah.
The triple podcast.
And it's
special.
still shorter than your average Into the North episode.
It's shorter than the average Mind Sculptors episode. What are you talking about? We're sitting here at 90 minutes almost. And most of our episodes are like 2.5 hours.
There's just not that much to say. You know, Thrasios, okay card.
I've heard that it had an impact on the meta at one point.
Well, with that said, everybody, thank you for tuning in. That about wraps things up for us here today. Just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at SculptyBoys, or you can find a direct link in our link tree in the description below. I want to also give an extra shout out to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you again for joining us, Spleen and Pongo. Appreciate you guys and your thoughts on this. And from all of us here at The Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan. We'll see you next time.